start by telling you why I actually wrote the book. What was my approach? Why did I think? You know, it took me about 10 years. It was really a lot of work. Why would I think that something like this is needed? And I can say very briefly, it came out of a frustration with the, let's say, with the image of Chinese history in the histories that we have. And I should say one thing. We have, of course, amazing historians, and there's a lot of historical work that's being produced. But what I'm now talking about is, we can call it macro histories. So these are histories that try to give an overview, that synthesize sort of the very specialized research that's being done, that portray Chinese history to a broader audience, an audience of students or other interested readers. So that's, I would say it's almost a different genre. There's a general large-scale history that gives an overview. And the existing books that we have, they were mostly written 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, as we all know, China looked very different, right? China was not at all, I mean, the differences are so immense. I remember that because roughly about the time when these histories were written, this was the time when I first visited China, around 1985, 1986. And when I first went to China, Beijing, China in 1985, you wouldn't believe it, there was not a single high-rise building. Beijing was so remarkable because it was all one-floor houses. And now today's China has changed considerably, and I think that also gives us a sort of prompts us to rethink Chinese history. When earlier history is written 30 or 40 years ago, what they tried to explain was why China was not as successful as the Western world, was not as developed as the West. So they were more interested in explaining China's backwardness. Necessarily, that made a lot of sense in the mid-1980s. That was at least the China they had to confront with. So they were interested in explaining why China was lagging behind. But if we now look at China, I think we don't have to explain Chinese failures. What's of interest now is no longer, I think, sort of understanding why China is lagging behind, but in fact, why China has achieved what it did. So that was sort of, I thought, the China that is portrayed in these books is not the China that we can see, that my students can see, that the readers can see, and we're missing a large part of that story if we try to understand the deficits, if you so will, the failures, the mistakes, if that is in the center in the book. Of course, I fully understand that a history, and that applies to the history of my own country, Germany, has always both, right? I mean, there are things that a nation can be proud of, and there are things that are problematic or in the history that shouldn't have happened. And so we always have to have a nuanced view of history. But I just thought we need a history that explains China's development that we have seen in the last 30 years. So that is really the starting point. So in my history, I accept the fact that China is a major country in the world. That China is now on more or less on equal. And that is the starting point for my history going back. And I was looking into this history to understand what are the historical sort of strengths, the historical advantages that China could bring to the table that would allow us to better understand how China developed. So that was one of the a big starting point for me. And the second point was also, I thought what we need a book is that really explains, that doesn't describe. My book, of course, history is always telling, you know, a series of events, of data, of names, but I wanted to go one step further and sort of rediscover, if you so will, analytical thinking. You know, in recent years, I think in the last 2-3 decades, sort of social sciences have become very analytical. But history, the discipline of history, is turned more to description or documentation, you know, telling stories. It's a lot of stories. But earlier generations, by the way, in the 19th century, historians have not written that way. So I wanted to go back rather to these earlier traditions of history writing that emphasize explanation, that identify causes, patterns, that allow us to understand why something has happened, not that it happened or when it happened, but also why it happened and what sort of sources, what sort of reasons we can discover. So meaning putting China, today's China, front and center for our exploration of history, emphasizing explanation. That is the basic approach that I tried to apply in the book. It also meant, however, you can only explain and identify causes and consequences if you are, as a historian, willing to go actually beyond the discipline of history. There are other disciplines that are sometimes very necessary to understand causes or identify causes for historical developments. For instance, demography. Right? Demography is a very big issue and topic in China's development in the last 350 years. So I looked into what demographers had to say, the kind of information they gave us. Also, I can give you another example, which is very important, I think, is the entire environment. Environmental history, environmental historians, geography, of course, also plays a big role. So I spent a lot of time to read through their work, especially in the 19th century and the 20th century, and what they have to tell us about how the physical environment was shaped by Chinese policies and what sort of consequences that had for the development of China's history. So it meant going beyond the, let's say, the comfortable zone of a historian and trying to engage with different fields of knowledge. That was also very, that was also one of my actually goals, or what I wanted to do. I should add one more thing, and that may sound in the beginning a little abstract, but in fact it isn't, because it's something that we are actually all very familiar with. In the book, because I want to explain things, and I want to explain developments, historical developments, I thought I need a certain approach that allows me to organize my materials. Earlier historians and earlier books were, for instance, often interested in culture, right? I mean, I think you are all familiar with these arguments, that we believe that a history, or a region's or country's history, is deeply shaped by mentalities or by cultural traditions, by values. I wasn't interested in writing a book that sees values as a driver. There's numerous reasons, because I think it's kind of misleading. It's very hard to identify these values, but the biggest problem for an historian is we never know how a person, how a leader, how people really believed in these values. We all know, there are competing values, and it's very hard to identify commitment to certain values historically. I mean, in the present, I can go and ask you, what do you believe in? But I cannot ask somebody 100 years ago. So I think it's a shaky ground to argue on that level of mentalities and values. It's abstract, it's hard to prove, there's no empirical work really that tells us these kind of things. So I try to avoid it. But I think one can really work with what I call institutions. So where other historians were interested in the role of cultural traditions, mentalities, I am interested in how do institutions shape the development of a society or of a history. Now, institutions, as defined by social scientists, are written or unwritten rules. Rules that allow people to collaborate or work together. We all need to work together. If we do not work together, there's very little a society, a company, even a city, a neighborhood, a village can achieve. Division of labor is absolutely fundamental, not only for modernity, but even for centuries. From the very beginning of the development of human civilization, it's based on collaboration. It's based on the division of labor, that there's some roles, some tasks, there's somebody taken over by somebody, and he does it because he knows he can get a certain outcome. So institutions make it possible for people to work together because they can trust that if I do this job, I will, for instance, get a certain reward. There is a certain outcome. There are expectations. These institutions give us expectations. We say, okay, yeah, I get salary, I get recognition for the kind of work. So and this must be regulated by something. There must be some sort of rules that determines that division of labor, makes it possible, and that is called institutions. So institutions are not organizations. A business is based on an institution in itself. It's an organization. So businesses, for instance, have their own rules, right? How this department does planning, this department, organizes supply. We allocate money for certain things. So there's these rules that govern, let's say, a business or a government administration. That's called an institution. I look at these institutions because I believe good institutions allow people to work together smoothly. Good institutions are fair. They distribute the profits and the labor and the responsibilities so that everybody is satisfied with it. Good institutions are inclusive, meaning, if you're interested, if you can contribute, there's no discrimination, for instance, or based on gender or based on race. These are, I would say, strong institutions. They work well because people can work together smoothly. Now, there are also institutions that do not work well. Institutions that are not so, that we can observe in history and have been used for a long time, but are seen as problematic because weak, for instance, are institutions that are coercive. You are not free to decide whether or not you want to contribute. You are forced. For instance, slavery. Slavery is a set of rules. Behind slavery is a set of rules that forces people, that compels people to do work without unclear benefits. And then we know, of course, that slavery was, while it was profitable for some who had, so to speak, the command, who could command the slaves to work, they had all the benefits, but they were, as an institution, it was a weak institution because it was resisted by those who were forced to work for the owner. So coercive institutions, extractive institutions are less efficient because they have to deal with resistance and so on and so forth. So why am I using institutions? Because I think it allows me a perspective to look at Chinese development, arguing, okay, China brought certain strengths, its own institutions, its unique institutions to the table. And based on that unique institutions and their traditions that come from it or that are connected to it, China was able, in fact, in the 20th century to go through the development that it went through. So in my perspective, it's China's own institutions that drive historical development. Not so much ideas, not so much ideology, not so much political power struggles or personalities or the big leaders. So when I look at certain things, I'm not so much interested in the leaders that everybody talks about, but rather in how things are organized on the ground in a society. And I think that offers us a good perspective, understanding both the strengths and the weaknesses. So the basic point here is to say China's development is a domestic story. It's China's own unique institutions and strengths that drive the development, not impact from the outside. That the Chinese development is made or broken in China. And so that's one of my most basic points that I try to make in the book. So it allows us to understand our continuities. It points to a country with unique institutional strengths and legacies, and understands the making of modern China as a process that's not driven by outside influence or intervention, but rather by its own or domestic achievements and interventions. So overall, I think that is very clear. There's a very different approach and perspective on Chinese history that other books that distinguish it from other existing books on China. So overall, my history starts in the late Qing period. And the late Qing period is often in the earlier books and histories portrayed as something that is a stagnant empire. You know, I'm from Germany, and we have a very famous philosopher. I'm sure you have heard the name, Friedrich Hegel. And Friedrich Hegel has written an immensely influential text about China that actually had impact far beyond Germany. And he said, you know, China, he called China is a country without history, because he said, you know, it's not developing, it's stagnant. You know, they don't have science, they are not interested in progress. It's just a stagnant society, a country without history. And that has actually then later also influenced a lot of social scientists, Max Weber, for instance. And then you find this in many history books, that Chinese Confucian society sort of wasn't a very dynamic society. It was mostly interested in maintaining order and stability, not in development. I think that's totally wrong. I'm actually speechless, because Chinese history is full of dynamics. It's full of changes. It's full of expansion and progress and development. And it's a complete misreading. And so I tell or portray the Qing as a country, as an empire that is enormously dynamic, that is very creative, that's very innovative, that expands its territory, that further develops its institutions, that is so successful that the population grows and continues to grow, that is at the center of a global trade network. Qing China has a huge trade surplus with Europe. It is already at that time that Qing China, you know, sells much more to Europe than Europeans can purchase from China. And what they're selling, I don't know if you have, yeah. And what they are selling is above all porcelain. In Europe, you can't produce porcelain before 1780. China produces porcelain. It's very useful. Porcelain is not for decoration. It's very useful because porcelain holds very hot liquids and food, and without, you know, that you are not burned. You can actually touch it because it cools. The outside keeps cool, and the temperature difference between hot liquid and the surface is pretty high. That's a unique quality of porcelain. You don't have it with metal. As you all know, if metal, you know, something, or iron, this is hot, you can't touch it, but you can touch. Has enormous, by the way, consequences for the kitchen, you know, for preparing food and so on, also in Europe. It's a real revolution. It's a revolution that has made possible by Chinese technology. It's not Western or European technology, it's Chinese technology. So it's sold in huge quantities, and it's produced for Western Europe. And this is an example here. It's also produced for Arabic countries. That is specially made to be sold in the Middle East. China also sold porcelain to India, South Asia. It also sold porcelain to Europe as well as to Eastern Europe. And it made different designs and different decors for this region. So the producers in China produced patterns or decor to cater to the taste of local customers in Europe. And that was already the case around 1700, 300 years ago. Amazing. So China was at the center of a global trade network. It's a commercialized, it's very successful country. And why is it successful? Because it has unique, sophisticated institutions. It has highly efficient markets. Because these markets, you know, in these markets, they understand to cater to the taste of different people. Different, you know, be there from different religious background, doesn't matter. Yeah. So these are fantastic, highly efficient, booming markets, but also you have an education system that's amazing. You have a bureaucracy that is very effective, that has, you know, many different layers and so on. For the task that it's supposed to do, it's very effective. You have a clear commitment to infrastructure. You have an amazing system of granaries, of disaster prevention and emergency, you know, and strategies to dealing with emergency. So it's a highly sophisticated, successful society based on a unique set of institutions. But in the 19th century, all this goes away, and China sort of goes into a steep, steep decline. So you see, this is an amazing story. It's a fantastic narrative. Here we have a country that is so successful for so long, and then within less than 100 years, it turns from a major center in the world to actually a laggard, or you can say, you know, what's then later called the sick man of the world. It becomes poor, destitute, underdeveloped, lagging behind, and that only in a very short period of time. So I make a side remark here. As historians, we often, of course, write about, you know, growing, becoming, improving, rising. But we are less interested actually in the other process. That's the decline, the fall. But in human history, this has occurred very often. No society, as we know, has managed to be forever developing, improving, growing, or rising. In fact, after a while, it always comes to an end. And I think we need to understand better what actually pushes a society into crisis, to the brink. And we have now the illusion that in modernity, you know, or post-modernity, we have kind of escaped this fatal cycle of growing and losing, or growing and going down, but I have my doubts. So that's why I'm so interested in this story. And to make that short, earlier historians have often blamed, again, Confucianism, stagnant mentalities, wrong ideas. China didn't understand the Western challenge, resisted the Western impact, or was only dependent on Western impact because itself was rather helpless, and therefore became humiliated and fell. But in my story, it's very different. I try to show that there are very specific historical reasons. And the first and most important reason for me is economic crisis. And that has something to do that people in Germany commit a severe copyright infringement on China. They steal technology from China. Above all, they steal porcelain technology. Porcelain is such a lucrative good. Of course, Europeans have been thinking, damn, I mean, these Chinese, they make all this money through global trade, you know. If we were produce porcelain, we could become rich. And so they study how porcelain in China is produced. They want to know, I mean, what's in there? How do you do it? And they actually ask Arab traders, and they steal the technology from China and produce and imitate porcelain in Germany, Sachsen, in Meissen, and after a while they produce it of similar quality, and that's the end of the porcelain trade. So China, which has probably sold millions of pieces per year, the estimate is something like over 100 to Europe alone, 100 million in a couple of decades in the 18th century. All of a sudden this market is gone. Silver, then there's other factors. Latin America comes under Western control, as you know, colonialism. Latin America was very important for silver production. Silver production goes down. That creates currency problems. We could call it a currency crisis. Financial institutions in China collapse. There are earlier banks, because they were very sophisticated, they collapse. There's a growing amount of debt that cannot be repaid. So obviously, we all know economic crisis can have severe effect on a society. We know that from 2008 and even earlier. If I just think, I'm from Germany, if you think about the big recession in 1930s or 20s in Europe, that was absolutely traumatizing to people. But in addition, we also have ecological problems. And I have to be brief here because I promised I speak only about 35 minutes. Ecological problems were both global and homemade in China. Globally, because climate pattern changed, the entire northern hemisphere has a change in precipitation. There are less rainfall, and that becomes the origin for a drought in China. And that's, in addition to that, there are homemade problems that have to do with the deforestation in China that has been going on by hundreds of years. We can say by 1800, practically all the forests were gone. There's no forest there. Earlier, you know, China, about 1,000 years ago, was covered by forests. But no, as you can see, if you all, I think, traveled to China, there's now no forest left. It's all gone. And that had enormous consequences, erosion, and so on and so forth. So all of this created political instability, unrests and rebellions, that further put society in turmoil. But then I think the main story for me, as you can of course guess, is institutions. Because earlier, you know, let's say a society faces economic downturn, faces social unrest, social disturbance, people start to protest, take to the streets, demonstrate. I mean, that's what these rebels basically did. Faces imperialism. I briefly didn't mention it, but imperialism, of course, also, so that means foreign threat, foreign military threat. It still can respond. It doesn't mean that you have to be defeated by these challenges, but you need institutions to do the right thing. You need policies to address the problems. You need to make changes. You need to say, okay, well, I mean, so far we had probably, you know, not invested. There is foreign technology around, for instance. So you can say, okay, we have to see that we get the foreign technology, this technology to China. Railways, other machines, and so on. But it didn't happen. China didn't do it, or delayed it. When it did, it was, as I write in the book, too little, too late. Why didn't it do it? Because basically the institutions were captured by special interests. That means those who were in power had only one concern, that they wanted to stay in power. And whatever threatened their hold on power or their hold on financial resources, these things were rejected. The ideas were all there. There were ideas in the 19th century by thinkers to reform the examination system, to create new schools, to let Chinese people learn foreign languages, to build arsenals, to train engineers, to train lawyers. But the governing dynasty didn't want it, because they said, okay, that could threaten us, and therefore declined. So in the end, for me, it's an institutional failure. I call it capture of special interests. We see it quite often. And I emphasize it today because any society is in danger that its institutions are captured by special interests that then make it impossible for necessary reforms to go. So this is the last slide. I'm going to make it.
No, you're doing just fine.
Okay. And so what we now see, and I have to make that short here, what we now see in the 20th century is the efforts to address the problems that I just told you about, resulting of the 19th centuries. Institutional decay, institutional failure, and to sort of try that China can enter the modern global landscape of progress and science and development. So I read the entire 20th century as a rocky, painful sort of effort and experiment to undo the 19th century crisis. And I think if we look at the first point, political ambitions, I think there's numerous examples from political leaders across the entire spectrum, from the far right to the far left, that all more or less express the same political ambition, that is to say, to recover or restore this earlier greatness of China. It's regardless of it's Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese nation, or it's Chiang Kai-shek, this militaristic generalissimo. He had really the same look at his book, China's Destiny. It's very obvious, you know, what for him China's destiny is. It's exactly that. Mao Zedong shares the same vision after 1949. It's also about making China again independent, strong and wealthy, a strong state, a wealthy country. And a similar vision we have in Deng Xiaoping. So the meta-narrative is clear and consistent. The difference is how to get there. Yeah? And there are fundamental disagreements between all these people I just told you about. There are fundamental agreements of how to do this. But the political ambition is sort of a constant driving force of the 20th century. So all these governments sort of do work on this program of bringing China back recovering it from this brink of disaster of the 19th century, but they differ profoundly in their institutional, in how they want to change or reform the institutions. So we have throughout the 20th century a number of experiments and tests, reforms and revolutions, destructions and modifications, to sort of find an adequate solution. So for me, this is the basic story. I tell the story of the 20th century as a story of very different institutional sort of, changing the rules of how society works. And in order to get to that one goal. So that is political ambition. So sustained institutional innovation is the result of it. There's a constant experiment. China experiments with so many things in the 20th century. It experiments, for instance, with military dictatorships as the best political institution to solve their problem. That's warlord China, that's a little bit of Chiang Kai-shek. China is interested in Chinese fascism in fascism in the 30s. Maybe fascism, the mobilization of society, the use of paramilitary forces, of extreme national, maybe that's a solution. So to order, to this. And then it experiments with socialism, it experiments with various forms of socialism, we have to say Maoism, as well as Stalinism. All these changes, and that now we come to one of the unique characteristics of China, all these changes left their mark. In China today, we can see basically the historical results of all these experiments in one form or another. There are still institutions around from the Kuomintang era. In fact, so the Kuomintang era, for instance, let me give you an example, was big in building a national centralized government. It was very important for Chiang Kai-shek, to have this, to maintain that centralized government. For instance, it did classify ethnicities for the first time into 5 ethnicities that exist in China, declaring them as minorities. This is a very strong, institutions are sets of rules. That's a very strong rule set. Very clearly, the nationalism is something. The nation state is clearly an institution of Republican origins. Mao's era left a lot of institutions that are still around in China. State-owned enterprises, planning agencies, the Danwei. What a powerful institution invented in Mao's China. Grassroots organizations of various sorts, neighborhood committees, that's still around. And then there's, of course, these institutional reforms that follow after 78 that sort of, introduce from the global Rome elements into the Chinese settings, which allow now to have some multinational, really corporations, Chinese corporations to exist, would have their own rule setting. So China's a very hybrid place where you find all these things next to each other. It creates a tension, and I believe that tension that it has explains some of the instabilities that China brings to the table. Then I should also say 2 more points. We have also important historical legacies that explain China's development in the last decades. So as you can tell already, I don't believe that China's rise or China's successful development in the last 40 years is only a matter of the last 40 years. I do believe it has a much longer history behind it. I believe China's development is the result of these 100 years of experiments and reforms and revolutions. It's only in the last 4 decades that we paid attention. But before that was already ongoing. And it's partly based on important historical legacies. My favorite example is the examination system, the Gaokao, that you have been asked about who took the Gaokao. The Gaokao is an institution, of course, it went through changes and reforms, but basically this idea that you use anonymous testing, standardized testing, rigorous standardized testing to select talent. That is a basic idea, a basic institution that we can see in the entire 20th century. I would say, the periods that there was no Gaokao examination system is actually very, very small. It was abolished in 1904, but it came already back in 1916. And then only to be reinstated later again. And even in the Mao's period, it was only during the Cultural Revolution that there were no examinations. Other than that, That's a very significant part. I think it's a major explanation for China's development. Other historical legacies, we have talked about this. It's China's highly efficient markets. Its traditions of business, of working on these markets, household farming, family businesses, and so on. So we also find in the economic sector a number of institutions that I think have historical roots, are revived after 78, and it's this revival that explains the success. So in the book I also write, I don't believe that the China's development is the result of a grand plan from the top after 78. I don't think, you know, of course the government in China would like to see it that way. You know, it's the wisdom of the leader. But I think basically, for me, a consequence is to say China's development is driven from the bottom, not so much from the top. In the beginning, and I give you the details in the book, in the beginning 78, for Deng Xiaoping, there is no blueprint. You know, there is no blueprint in the beginning. It's opportunistic policies. It's testing, it's looking, but it's mainly the peasants, the people that work in the countryside that revive these markets, that immediately go back to family farming, are very successful. They make it possible. That's when it and then afterwards, it's the entrepreneurial innovation from very many people that makes that possible. It's not top down. And then my final point is to say skillful exploitation of unique global opportunities. China's development is critically dependent on the world. Always has been. Always has been. It's a country with open borders, you know, very little protection. It's open. It's always been open. This is very clearly to be seen. For instance, China was more than half of its history, it was ruled by non-Chinese people. It was so open, you know, that there's no parallel, I think. It was also dependent on resources. It needed, you see, already in late Qing period, China, we talked about this, China's economic development depended on the world market, selling porcelain to Europe. So that makes it necessary for China to use these global opportunities. And this is also a very important point. China's development depended that it made use of these opportunities that opened up. 78 was really, I think 78, it used a unique configuration in the world, the end of the 70s, you know, the end to the Cold War that was, of course, still ongoing, but there was movement on all sides. There were, you know, movements in Eastern Europe. It is a period, the end of the 70s, that is already a global crisis. Think about the Club of Rome. Think about the fears about that, you know, maybe there's an energy problem. It's at the end of the cycle in Europe, of a growth and development cycle in Europe. The economies are maturing. And then here's China. And China opens up just at the right moment, when because salaries have been risen, a lot of companies are willing to move. And it's also now possible because of technological advancement. So they use that time. My thesis is, earlier or later, China's development would have not been able to be as successful. So the timing is of the essence. Just as I'm arguing that in late Qing China, it was too little too late, you know, it could have, in 78, it was just the right time. It was just about the right time. So that also means while China's story is written domestically, it nonetheless is and always has been a country that is sort of dependent on the world. So now we have talked about all these strengths. But China has one fundamental weakness. It has never found a stable political institution to replace the empire. The empire and the emperor, the gentry, the bureaucracy maintained stability, you know, relative, amazing stability, continuity over hundreds of years. The 20th century is a period of constant regime change, if you so will. There's a constant back and forth. It's not only regime, it's amazing how these things, from Mao's, you know, revolutionary utopia to Deng Xiaoping's market, you know, socialism with Chinese currency, introducing market economy to socialism. China has not found a stable political institution because I think it has this constitutional dilemma, meaning it doesn't know exactly what its relationship is to the people. Who is in charge? Who can say what? You know, who can participate in what sort of discussion or in what sort of decision? So for me, these are brittle political institutions up until today. China cannot know. Legitimacy is, of course, a complicated word, but I understand it is a consensus, some sort of popular support, popular acceptance. I think it can never be sure. Popular acceptance has always been in question throughout the entire 20th century, and therefore my conclusion at the end of the book is rather skeptical. There's been a lot of achievements, but China can be, always has been, at once powerful, but also powerfully insecure. Thank you very much for listening.